Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ICFJ Pamela Howard Forum on Global Crisis Reporting. My name is Patrick Butler. I am the Senior Vice President of Content and Community at the International Center for Journalists, or ICFJ. We are based in Washington, D.C. And today, in the run-up to World Press Freedom Day next week, we are partnering with the Voice of America to host this very important discussion with four accomplished veteran journalists who are reporting or helping journalists report in very challenging environments where the media is not always protected. So from the battlefields of Ukraine to the US-Mexico border where journalists are being killed at alarming rates, to jail cells in China, Turkey, Eritrea, and so many more countries, and a multitude of countries where governments are doing everything they can to censor independent news. The situation is not all that good right now. We're going to talk about that, but we're also going to talk about what journalists are doing to fight back. So we don't want this to be a total downer of a conversation. But in light of this unfortunate trend of declining press freedom globally, we really want to learn from the experiences of these four journalists on how to operate in difficult environments and how to report in dangerous times. So let me introduce our panel. We have with us today Aliza Appelbaum, who is ICFJ's Senior Program Director. She works on mostly on programs in Latin America, and one of her focuses is Nicaragua, one of the worst countries in the Americas for press freedom. So we'll talk about that, but we'll also talk about other parts of the region. Sirwan Kajjo is VOA's press freedom reporter covering Ukraine and Russia, and he has previously covered Syria, where he is from, so sees a lot of links between what's happening now in Ukraine and Russia and what he's covered previously in the Middle East. Samiullah Mahdi is ICFJ Program Director and an ICFJ Knight International Journalism Award winner. He is from Afghanistan, and that is a country that has sort of slipped out of the public view, unfortunately, in part because of the war in Ukraine. But we feel very strongly that we need to be paying attention to the tragedies that are happening in Afghanistan. And finally, Salem Solomon is VOA News Center editor who has covered press freedom issues across Africa. We're going to especially be talking about issues in the Horn of Africa, where she is from, but we will expand to cover issues that are across the whole continent. So before we begin, I want to remind everyone that we encourage you to join the ICFJ Pamela Howard Forum on Global Crisis Reporting if you haven't already. You'll be joining almost 13,000 colleagues from around the world who are participating in the forum in English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. And please stay tuned for news of the launch of the forum in Arabic coming very soon. As always, we encourage you to visit our website for journalists all over the world, the International Journalists Network, or IJNet. There you're going to find stories on journalism trends, toolkits on everything from media management to video storytelling, and opportunities for training, fellowships, journalism contests, and more. It's in all of the languages I just mentioned, plus Chinese, Persian, and Russian. As we get started, I want to remind you that you can post your questions for our panel in the Zoom chat or the Q&A. And if you're on Facebook, you can post under the live stream post, and my colleagues will get me those questions. We're going to talk with our panelists now for a little while, and then we will take the questions from the audience. I'm going to start with a question for each of you. Give us a little bit of a background on what's been happening in the regions you specialize in regarding press freedom. What have been some of the common challenges that journalists are facing, particularly in your area? I want to start with Sirwan because Russia and Ukraine are so much on everyone's minds right now, and then we'll go to the rest of our panel. So Sirwan, tell us a little bit about what's going on in Russia and Ukraine.
Sure, thank you, Patrick, and I like to thank the ICFJ and Voice America for this opportunity. The situation in Ukraine is multi-layered. You have the first and most important issue is safety. As we've seen since the beginning of the Russian invasion, at least 9 journalists have been killed in either direct fire from the Russian forces or getting caught in the conflict, being in the wrong place and the wrong time. We also have journalists who cover the conflict from inside the Russian Federation, which have also increasingly being silenced by the Russian government. Certain laws have been passed since the beginning of the war that basically prevents Russians and the few independent media that operate there from reporting objectively on the war. But on the Ukrainian side, there are so many issues that journalists are used to. First of all, these are people who cover their own conflict, so they have so many concerns as the conflict unfolds. They have families. A lot of them have been separated from their families for the past 40 days or so, and so you have the human side of it, because at the end of the day, these are people who are affected directly by what's happening in their neighborhoods and in their cities and towns, and but they still do have to wake up every morning, or not wake up, continue to work around the clock, and report on these different local conflicts that are unfolding in Ukraine, which is an issue that I was actually told by all the journalists that I have been speaking with in Ukraine. This is something that they have never seen. A lot of them have been covering the conflict since 2014, but the scale of the invasion and the scale of the attacks that are taking place throughout the country. Now the focus is obviously on the eastern part of the country, but in the beginning, first of all, nobody expected that Russia would actually invade the country, so they were not fully prepared. Newsrooms were not 100% prepared, which leads me to the safety issue that a lot of these journalists were killed, either foreign or local. They did not expect the scale of the attacks to be so massive, and so which requires, right now, I think there are several initiatives, important initiatives that are taking place inside Ukraine. In Lviv, the RSF, for example, has set up a training center, a resource center, basically providing equipment and ad hoc training to journalists who are going there. But also the fact that there's so many journalists, like this is in the heart of Europe. The conflict is right there. So a lot of European journalists from across the continent are going there. Most of them do not have experience, and the vast majority are actually freelancers, which makes it more challenging in terms of their safety and in terms of the way they operate inside in a country where even locals find a lot of issues. I can go into more specifics.
Yeah, you've given us a lot of issues that we want to delve into. So thank you for that overview. So many issues involved in the war in Ukraine. Let's go to Sami next and talk a little bit about Afghanistan, which of course was very much in the news about 6 months ago, but has kind of, as I mentioned earlier, dropped off a little bit from the news. Sami, you were in Kabul really up to the very last moment, then when you had to leave because of the threats to you and your family. Tell us a little bit about what's going on for the Afghan journalists who are still there that I know you keep in very close touch with.
Thank you so much, Patrick, and everyone. I want to thank VOA and ICFJ for this opportunity. Well, as you know, we had a very vibrant media ecosystem in Afghanistan for the past 20 years. We had over 100 TV channels running, over 1,000 publications and magazines, and hundreds of radio stations. And this was a very new and young industry in Afghanistan, because as most of our audiences might remember, during the 1990s, we didn't have this kind of freedom of expression in Afghanistan, and Taliban had banned all kinds of video and TV in Afghanistan. Watching a TV was forbidden, and people people would be imprisoned for watching a simple video or listening to music at that time. So during this 20 years, we had this revolution of freedom of expression in the country until August 15, 2021. Since then, the most recent figures and numbers show that over 6,000 journalists have lost their jobs in the country.
Amazing.
Over 40% of media outlets are closed down. Over 85% of our female journalists have lost their jobs. Mm-hmm. Over 80 journalists were imprisoned and tortured by the Taliban. And when I say tortured, it involves very severe tortures by the Taliban. And some of the videos and photos and images have been published by international media. The most recent news about imprisoning journalists in Afghanistan is about a reporter in Herat who criticized the Taliban on his Facebook page. And the day before yesterday, I think a martial court of the Taliban imprisoned him for a year, sentenced him for a year in prison. So that's the situation now in Afghanistan, and Taliban are just enforcing more and more restrictions on media. And I think self-censorship is growing now, because Taliban used to come to the newsrooms with their guns and weapons, and ask editors to edit their news reports according to their policies. And they have imprisoned a number of newsreaders, reporters, and also those commentators who would go to newsrooms and participate in TV shows for their anti-Taliban views. I think again, media and freedom of expression has been under tremendous pressure since August 15, and we journalists in Afghanistan and media workers are very, very concerned that we are going to face something very similar to 1990s under the Taliban.
Yeah, there were a lot of people who thought the Taliban would be different this time. It's a different Taliban from before, but that really has not proved to be the case, unfortunately. Let's move to Africa. Salem, I know you are actually from Eritrea, which is one of the worst countries in Africa in terms of press freedom. Tell us a little bit about that country and what's going on there, and especially as well some of the neighboring countries, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, ICFJ and VOA for organizing this event, and an important event leading up to press freedom. My home country, as you mentioned, is ranked lowest on the press freedom chart. Before I go into that, I sit at the Voice of America. I sit at a global desk, just basically seeing most of the countries that you see whenever there's conflict. Someone aptly said, the first casualty of war is truth. And who are the conveyors of truth are journalists. And you see that in most parts of the world. But for most part of my career, I've covered Africa as a continent, and mostly, of course, my expertise is the Horn of Africa. I'm originally from Eritrea. And so, in particular, the Horn of Africa is one of the one part of the world where press freedom has taken a big step backward in recent years, right before the invasion of Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The biggest conflict and war that we've been experiencing is the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia. Ethiopia, there's been an effort to prevent the media from covering the ongoing war in the northern region of the country in Tigray that began in November 2020. There are other conflicts spreading in other regions of the country right now, where journalists are essentially prevented from covering pressing issues, where human rights abuses by authorities are happening in the dark. And recently, journalists from within the country and outside the country documented, even in 2021 alone, 46 journalists were detained in and out in Ethiopia, making the country one of the worst jailers of journalists in Africa, along with my home country, Eritrea. Eritrea might be a special case, and we'll get into it a little bit later on in the discussion, but there's been regular government-imposed internet shutdowns. The reason why I want to emphasize on how it's government-imposed is because most of these countries, internet is owned by the government, solely owned by the government, meaning the government has a dominant, control over the flow of information, putting journalists, in a very vulnerable situation. And so, the country, for instance, Ethiopia, you can see that there's been organized global effort among not just internally, but also in the diaspora. For some of us who cover the country from here in Washington, D.C., you see that there's the sentiment that we are noticing that there's a disparaging of or discrediting the media, both domestically and internationally. You see protests, pro-government rallies here in Washington, D.C., where, it's so common to see signs proclaiming coverage of the war as quote unquote fake news, which, is an oxymoron when you think about the word, the phrase itself, because if it's fake, it's not news. And you see the notion that major media organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, VOA, all of these outlets being basically seen as lying or distorting the coverage of the war that's happening in Tigray and Ethiopia and other parts of Ethiopia, the region in general, where there's essentially a blackout happening right now. And so this has gained traction somehow, and even among educated Ethiopians that we see when we're covering or speak to people. And so I would say hostility toward the media is higher, and it's been that it has been in recent history from covering the continent, the region for as long as I have. And the difficulty of covering the war has increased in the last year. When the government declared the state of emergency, it's been lifted in February now, but it gave it powers to restrict movement of reporters within the country that face enormous challenges already. But that state of emergency allowed the journalists to be restricted and prevented from traveling to many areas where these conflicts are happening. And there is also legal arm that basically puts reporters in a very dangerous situation where it's called the anti-terror law, and the country has been using to prosecute journalists who cover rebel groups. Essentially, basically, if you interview someone, right, you're aiding or abetting a group that's designated as a terrorist group. And so I will give specific examples of what this means for the country in Sudan, following a military coup just recently reversed democratic gains that we've been witnessing. Again, government shutdown, blackout of internet and communication. And so, as I said, governments basically first, they come for those who convey the truth, and shut down television stations. 36 radio stations across the country were affected by this, basically trying to curtail the flow of information. So this is the environment, at least in the Horn, that we're witnessing the decline in the flow of information and essentially press freedom.
Great. You've given a lot of fodder for more questions. We're definitely going to talk about some of the ways that technology is being used to shut down the flow of information, and when we had hoped that it would be something that would abet or aid the flow of free information. So now let's go to Latin America. Aliza, you work on lots of different areas of Latin America, but I think Nicaragua is one place where you have focused quite a bit. It's a place close to my heart. I lived there some time ago. And tell us a little bit about the really horrible situation for journalists in that country and how the government has shut down the free flow of information there.
Thanks, Patrick. I do definitely want to talk about Nicaragua, but before I do, I just wanted to also start out by saying that, in Latin America and the Caribbean, there are quite a number of countries where it's dangerous to be a journalist right now. And in fact, the #1 country in the world where it is dangerous to be a journalist right now is Mexico. Just this year, in just 4 months of 2022, 8 journalists have been killed so far, which is really awful. And, in Haiti and Colombia, there are other similar cases, not quite at that level, but there are a number of hotspots in the area. Nicaragua is a case of particular concern. I would say that press freedom has definitely kind of been on the downslide there since 2018. And there are a number of ways that it's gotten a lot worse, specifically in 2021 in the lead up to the most recent elections. So, as press freedom has been on the decline in Nicaragua, it already was in a rough place. Even before 2018, the number of independent media outlets in the country was only about 20%, which is not great. And it was difficult for those 20% to get advertisers and funding. And since 2018, it's really been a stark difference. A lot of those independent journalists are now in exile around the world. And to their credit, a lot of them have really continued publishing. A number of new digital media outlets have sprung up, but it is a country that relies pretty heavily on radio for news. So, people from exile can only really do so much. And we know that there are a lot of people in the country who just don't have access to anything beyond state-sponsored media right now.
I want to ask you, while I'm with you, Aliza, I want to talk a little bit about what the role of the international community is in cases like Nicaragua and also in Mexico, which you talked about. Is there enough being done by governments from around the world to pressure Nicaragua, as well as, in terms of the legal ways that the government is, jailing journalists and all of that kind of thing? But in Mexico, we're also seeing, and across Latin America, a horrendous tradition of impunity. If you kill a journalist, you're rarely punished for it. So if you could talk a little bit about what the role of the international community is in getting these governments to stop restricting media, but also to investigate crimes against journalists.
Well, in Nicaragua, I think, unfortunately, the answer is that not that much has been done. And in fact, a lot of international organizations are leaving the country or have left the country already. The most recent example being the OAS. The OAS criticized the Ortega election in 2021. And after that, they got kicked out, it was supposed to be a more long-term thing, but they decided the ambassador quit and all of the international staff are being kicked out just this week. So that's one less international watchdog right there. In Mexico, I think that there's definitely been a lot more action on the civil society front than there has been from the international, from other international institutions. I wouldn't say it's something that people don't talk about or don't realize. I actually think it's something that is gaining a lot more traction, but I think that most activists would prefer to see some more like strict things being done, some more actionable items being taken beyond just a basic condemnation. To go back to Nicaragua, for example, there has been some definite condemnation from the US government, but there haven't really been as many specific actions taken as I think other civil society activists and journalists who are endangered would like to see. Yeah. And I think that that's really true in Mexico as well.
I'll kind of throw that question to the rest of you as well, and for any of the three of you who want to talk about what the world should be doing to help journalists in the countries where you're working. Let's start with Salem. We're going to go backwards through the group and tell us about Africa. What's happening in terms of pressure being put on governments to protect journalists?
Thank you again. I would like to mention, of course, my home country, which has been serving as an example of what really happens when governments crack down on independent press and curtail the flow of information, impose basically an information blackout and internally control how people consume news. But to Aliza's point about the condemnation that you hear from the international community or the world, or some of us who are outside covering these countries, one of the most important things that I've focused on over the years is, yes, we can report about these cases of arrests. We can report about these cases of disappearances in Eritrea. And, last year was the 20th anniversary of reporters and journalists that have literally disappeared. We're talking about journalists whose whereabouts are unknown, detained for 20 plus years. And when we're talking about prison, it's unlike other countries where maybe you have a lawyer representing you, or maybe you have family access to really at least see the conditions of the people. That's not the case in Eritrea. Some of these reporters, simply because there was in 2001, there was a conflict and there was a mass crackdown on the independent media outlets there. Even family members don't have closure as we speak today. That people who've been arrested. The government has thrown away the keys, basically, essentially. And so international community, including reporters and mainstream outlets, have reported about this nonstop. Human rights groups, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and all these others, including CPJ, RSF has done every anniversary of many, reporting about the dire situation. And so what's next? What's next after amplifying the nature in which these human rights abuses essentially are happening to journalists? What I've seen positive development from exiled journalists is that the international community maybe could think of supporting press freedom efforts to cover stories that are pressing. It could be corruption, it could be human rights abuses, like what we're talking about, journalists being the extension of that. But when this happens, you see other human rights abuses in these countries. And so going back to this specific example of Eritrea, I think these instances could serve as an example of what can happen, but also what people are doing to circumvent that kind of either abuse online, offline. And so more support to local journalists, more support to journalists that have been forced to leave their countries but continue to report is what I would.
And thank you. And that's the case in Afghanistan too, where so many journalists have had to leave the country and are trying to run independent news sites from abroad that can reach Afghans. Tell us about that, Sami. Again, same question. What can the international community do to improve the situation, or try to improve the situation in Afghanistan? And also, what's happening with journalists outside of Afghanistan? Are they able to provide reliable information to audiences inside the country?
I think that's a very important question. I mean, both questions are very important. The role that the international community could play to improve the situation in Afghanistan and other countries in similar situations, and also about what those journalists who are abroad now, what they could do. The international community, I'm sorry to say, but they're not doing much. The most recent report by the UN Special Envoy to Afghanistan was disheartening for so many people in Afghanistan. It was full of appeasements to the Taliban, and saying sentences like Taliban are unhappy that we are not giving them, the international community is not giving them enough credit for ending the war, for reducing the civilian casualties in Afghanistan, and so on. I think that kind of approach and that kind of mindset that there is a Taliban 2.0, doesn't make any difference, and it only emboldens the Taliban. So as you know, the Taliban are looking for international recognition. The Taliban are very much looking for international aid to come, because without international aid and financial support, they will not be able to run a government in Afghanistan. So I think the international community could use these things and so many other options as a leverage to, to uphold and make the Taliban more responsible towards human rights, freedom of expression, minorities' rights, as well as women's rights. Just today, Taliban issued a new decree banning women going out without wearing a burqa, a full burqa. So I think international community has that leverage still to use to reduce the pressure on freedom of expression on the Taliban, but it's not used that way, unfortunately. And I think the war in Ukraine and also the kind of the convenience feeling that maybe we have dealt enough with Afghanistan and we should leave Afghanistan to, be the way it is. And I see, unfortunately, many international media reporting on Afghanistan, which does not reflect the realities on the ground. They have been in a mood that this is the reality of Afghanistan. Taliban are the real reality of Afghanistan. That's not the reality of Afghanistan. Taliban is just a group, several thousand gunmen who have taken the control of the country. It doesn't mean that 40 million people are like that in Afghanistan. And their ideology never got popularity above 15% in the country. Mm-hmm. And coming to the second part of your
just wanted to briefly, if you can tell us a little bit about how Afghans are getting independent news.
I see a very good collaboration between those journalists who have left the country and those who are still remaining in the country. We shouldn't forget that the majority of reporters are still inside the country, facing harsh situation. So, but those who have gotten out of the country, including myself, we are trying to, touch base with our colleagues who are in the country. And some of our very good media outlets, like Itlaat Rose, one of our best dailies, newspapers, Hashtasok, and many others, they are almost out of the country, but still using their freelancers, their connections across the country to report on every single thing happening, especially things related to human rights abuse and violation of human rights, especially against minorities, women, and others.
Yeah. And I'm sure they have to be very careful to protect those people who are still in Afghanistan, who could undoubtedly, face the prison and torture that you talked about earlier, if perhaps.
I think, Patrick, I should include one more sentence, that we have experienced that Taliban would come to the newsroom of or the offices of these news outlets that I mentioned and pressurized them. That if you're going to, release anything similar in the future, we are going to imprison you or close down your offices. But some of those reporters have been telling the Taliban that we are not involved in this kind of reporting. These are our colleagues who are abroad now. But I don't think that will last for long, and Taliban will crack down on everyone.
All right, let's go back to Sirwan then. We talked, of course, about the horrible situation for journalists who are covering the war in Ukraine and the alarming number of journalists who have been killed there. Let's talk a little bit about Russia as well, where we talked about exiled journalists in all three of the other regions. Tell us about what it's like for Russian journalists who are trying to provide news for audiences inside Russia. And are there any independent journalists left in the country inside?
Yeah, unfortunately, the few remaining independent media outlets that were operating in Russia had to shut down because of very harsh laws that the Russian government issued with the in the early days of the invasion, laws that essentially prevented the local media to call the war a war, and so a lot of journalists from, for example, the Echo of Moscow radio station or the Novaya Gazeta, newspaper, which is an investigative publication, they had to shut down to avoid being prosecuted by the Russian authorities. Now, a lot of journalists, over 100 journalists, have been have fled the country since the beginning of the invasion, simply because they did not want to stop reporting on what's happening in Ukraine, but also staying in Russia was a risk that they preferred to not take. Instead, some of them did take and faced prosecution and trial, and had to pay fines. But the vast majority have left. Those independent journalists have left the country. They've been reporting from neighboring countries. Effectively, the state has dominated the media, the coverage of the war in Ukraine. As you know, the government calls it a special military operation, and unfortunately, the vast majority of the population only gets its news through state-sponsored media. Now, the exiled media has also been effective. I recently spoke with an editor of a US-based publication that shifted the focus of his local coverage from Sacramento, California to what's happening in Ukraine because of that gap, to fill that void of war coverage in Ukraine. And as a result, his website was banned in Russia, among others, including VOA's Russian language service, as well as the BBC and the Deutsche Welle and so many others. So the exiled Russian journalists have been doing an excellent job to fill that void. It's not as it should be because they lack the resources, they lack the capabilities to reach out to all the vast majority of the Russian audiences, but at least they can counter the propaganda that comes from Kremlin and other government agencies in Russia.
Great. I do want to talk now about some things that maybe we can learn from journalists who are fighting against this tide of disinformation and government crackdowns. I'm going to start with you again, Sirwan. You just talked a little bit about the Russian journalists who are struggling to provide information to Russians who are really awash in a sea of propaganda. Where are you seeing effective strategies to get around government censorship? And you can expand this to other countries, including Syria, where you are from and have worked for many years. What are some of the things that journalists are able to do to get information to populations that can counter the propaganda?
Sure. Well, before I get into that, there were a lot of similarities between Ukraine and Russia in terms of the way the Russian governments, the tactics that the Russian military used apply to target civilian infrastructure, including journalists. Journalists, at the end of the day, are civilian and not military targets, and that's what the UN has been saying since the beginning. But as the war was unfolding, I started thinking about this is a page taken from Russia's playbook in Syria. Everything that Russia did in Idlib and Damascus suburb and Aleppo and elsewhere in Syria since the beginning of its formal intervention in 2015 has been happening in Ukraine. And so I started talking to more journalists on both sides, and they all kind of agreed that this is exactly what's been happening. And it's interesting that a group of Syrian journalists actually started doing, providing tips and advice to their Ukrainian colleagues on what to avoid, what to do, and how to go around, for example, Russian censorship, not only direct attacks on media outlets in Ukraine, but also how to avoid being censored by the Kremlin propaganda machine. And so I thought that was interesting. The same situation is true in both countries, because the enemy, from the perspective of the Syrian journalists and Ukraine, is essentially the same. And so and back to your point, I think emphasizing on the importance of local media and is I believe we've seen that in Syria, and the way the US and the UK and many other Western countries supported local media was important. Now, of course, the media landscape in Ukraine and Russia is completely different. We had the margin, we had a space where journalists in Ukraine could operate, a margin of freedom also. We did not have that in Syria prior to the 2011 civil war, but that funding that came from Western governments helped establish a very new an alternative media that was able to reach out to people throughout the country, because in Syria, media was so centralized, it was so controlled by the Damascus regime, that rural areas around the country, and this is a very diverse country with people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds, did not have access to news. They did not see themselves in the news coverage prior to the war. And so something similar in Ukraine would be useful. Ukraine is a big country, and these new initiatives that media groups and international bodies are doing would be more effective if they designed it in a way that it can, because at the end of the day, news is always local. If I don't see anything relevant to my neighborhood, to my district, I won't be as interested, so and emphasize on supporting local media outlets would be something of significance on the long run, because the world is still unfolding, and of course the aftermath, the media has been playing an important role in conveying what's happening in Ukraine, and also documenting possible and alleged war crimes. Oh, sorry, I muted myself by mistake. Sorry about that. So I just to add to that, my last point I was raising, journalists in many parts of in many conflict zones have been essential in documenting war crimes. We saw that in Syria, we saw that elsewhere, and we've been seeing that in Ukraine. In Bucha, for example, journalists were the first who arrived at the scene to document the atrocities that Russian soldiers left behind. And so that's basically what I want to see in Ukraine, more support for local media.
And I think you made a really important point too about how Syrian journalists are helping Russian journalists because they've seen these techniques and they can help them use them. We know that dictators share a common playbook, and everybody from Egypt to Nicaragua to Venezuela to Vietnam, they're all using the same tactics. They learn from one another. So we need to do the same thing, and that's a great example of that. Sami, we'll go through each of you on this question, then we're going to open it up to the audience. So Sami, tell us what any encouraging signs that you're seeing in Afghanistan, in what people are doing, what journalists are doing, and what media development organizations are doing to counter the Taliban crackdown on independent news.
Well, I see journalists continue reporting from Afghanistan. At the same time, I see a lot of self-censorship by media and journalists in Afghanistan. But at the same time, it's very visible that, as I mentioned earlier, that those who are outside the country with those who are inside still have a very strong bonds and connection, exchanging information. I think people are learning from cases like Syria, and also from Myanmar and other countries where journalists were under severe restrictions for the past decade or so. So that's happening, and also I see a lot of new initiatives popping out outside the country.
Mhm.
Those journalists who are outside the country are trying to build new TV stations, new websites, new newspapers to, if Taliban are cracking down on media inside the country, so we will have a space for ourselves to continue reporting and continue informing the public in Afghanistan. Because it's almost impossible now inside the country to get the kind of critical reporting that we were used to, because Taliban will not allow that. So reporters who are outside the country have been continuing reporting from the outside with some access to real raw material from inside the country and from villages, from districts and so on. But, reporting from outside always has its challenges. It's not easy when you are not present on the ground, when you cannot verify facts independently, when you do not have access to information from the state. It's very, very hard. But we are looking for ways to navigate this challenge. We'll see what will happen. But Taliban have not started censoring the internet now. Actually, a few days ago, they issued a new decree banning TikTok in Afghanistan. They asked the Ministry of Telecommunication to ban TikTok in Afghanistan because, according to the Taliban, that's ruining the morals of the youngsters in the country.
TikTok is also used to spread information.
Of course, it's a entertainment tool for many youngsters, but at the same time, as you mentioned, it is used for spreading news and information.
Okay. Salem, let's go to Africa. There are actually some bright spots in Africa, some countries where media freedom is perhaps improving, or at least is in a better state than the Horn of Africa countries that you've talked about. Are there any things that you're seeing in Africa that we can learn from in terms of countering the things you've talked about in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Sudan?
Thank you for that. I would like to start by just making a point about how most conflicts or countries in Africa have seen this before. Even when you talk about Russia and its basically disinformation campaign before, because Russia has a hybrid model to exert its influence on different parts of the world, not just with the conflict right now, but it has an arm to spread disinformation before it does other be it sending mercenaries and other efforts it has. In Africa, because of nascent democracies in most parts of the continent, what you see prior to either mercenaries going in or other conflicts starting when Russia is involved is the concerted effort of disinformation, basically because there's lack of media literacy in most parts of the continent. That environment is exploited, and you see social media being used as a way to spread falsehoods, demonize journalists, independent journalism, or anything that might be against their interests there, or if they're aligned with the governments that they're working with. So I would like to establish that, because what we see now happening in Ukraine and other parts of the world, most adversarial kind of governments like Russia, even sometimes China, what we see is that that media aspect of it is a way to amplify propaganda, and the power of propaganda in the environment where there's no independent journalism is very, very dangerous. And so, some positive, to your point about positive spots where we've seen, journalists either circumventing these efforts to stifle information or, being forced to go to exile, being exiled because of a threat to their lives, to their families, lives within. We've seen reporters from the diaspora trying to tap into their network because, as Sirwan was saying earlier, one of the most important assets, especially exiled journalists have, is connections to and language skills to the places that they've fled from and they've been covering for as long as maybe their adult lives, And so we've seen positive signs of, even with little support that some have. We've seen, online platforms starting up in Europe and other or neighboring countries. Another thing that I've noticed, especially covering the conflict in Ethiopia in the past, couple of years, is still going. What I've seen whenever there is a blackout, complete government blackout of information, technological tools, as much as they can also be platforms to spread disinformation, if the right people are involved, could be used for exposing atrocities,
Right.
be it geolocating, satellite imagery that comes out from all these places, open source data that is being used to vet it. Sometimes because of social media, soldiers might document atrocities they might be committing themselves. And so with the help of journalists abroad here and locally, that, you would be able to vet videos that come out and document real-time human rights abuses, and hopefully in the hopes of holding perpetrators to account, which is what journalism and public service can do in this environment. And so there are signs of hope in terms of holding perpetrators to account and continuing to report. One case I'd like to mention of a trial that—
Very briefly, I do want to get to questions and we're running late. So if you can—
Okay. Most of the time that we see when reporters are killed or attacked in parts of the world, in West Africa now, there's a case in Gambia case where a journalist from AFP killed in 2004. Now there's a big trial in Germany across a different part of the world, and I'm really looking forward to what that entails. There's one person that's on trial, held hopefully to account to. He was part of a hit squad in a previous regime. And so we'll see how that pans out, but it's important to see because in most cases when reporters are killed, their perpetrators are not really held to account. So
Exactly.
I'm looking forward to see what comes out of that trial.
Yeah, that gets back to the impunity question. That is so true all over the world. And I'm glad you mentioned some of the ways that technology is being used for good. Some of the open source intelligence that journalists are using to document the crimes, things that Bellingcat has pioneered, for example, are some great positive steps. Aliza, tell us a little bit about if there are positive things you've seen in Latin America, in the countries where you focus, that we can learn from.
I think I'm maybe going to be a little bit more pessimistic than my colleagues right now, with apologies. I think I've probably seen fewer things that make me feel optimistic in Latin America recently, but one thing I do want to mention is citizen journalism. So I mentioned that in 2018, is when kind of things started taking a nosedive in Nicaragua. But one thing that did end up being really helpful was there were a lot of journalists who didn't feel safe going out and covering protests because journalists were being targeted and attacked. But they were able to kind of form these informal networks using systems like WhatsApp and Signal to kind of form groups so that people who were citizen journalists, who were not traditional journalists, could go out. They could take photos and videos during these protests, share them with their reporter colleagues, and then kind of get the news out to larger networks. And this was also a time when the Ortega regime was literally blocking imports of ink and paper to stop newspapers from publishing. So like really anything that could be done, I think was really positive. And obviously things have changed since then, and this is not something that's an option in every country or under every situation, obviously. But I do think that it's something that has been successful, and I am interested to see how that kind of ecosystem can evolve over time.
That's a great example. Yeah, and I think we've seen that in many other parts of the world too, but I'm glad you focused on that. Let's turn now to questions from our audience. We have quite a few. I'll take the first one. It's for Sirwan from Mihaela Biliovsky. I'm sure I'm pronouncing your name wrong, and I apologize for that. But Mihaela would like to know about restrictions on press freedom coming from the Ukrainian government, if there have been any.
That's a very good question and a challenging one, in the sense that since the beginning of the conflict, what the Ukrainian government did is creating something called national marathon. And by that, they meant that everybody, news groups and media outlets, everyone will have to rally behind the government in its support, in its fight, and the war. And so what they did initially started at the idea between the 5 major news networks in Ukraine to collaborate and join forces and try to come up with one platform to broadcast news around the clock. And the government liked the idea, but the government, what they did, they used it. The president's office, President Zelensky, issued a decree essentially making it into a law that all major channels, and there are 5, I think two layers were added to that list, basically to combine their efforts to continue their broadcast 24/7. Now this is wartime reporting, and it makes it really difficult for journalists to editorialize certain things. For example, just like and many journalists who have been covering the war agree that just like there is a disinformation campaign coming from Moscow, there's a similar one to counter it coming from Kyiv. And so unfortunately, Ukrainian journalists have not been able to report independently from the government's narrative. Mm-hmm. And of course, I'm sure there's so many journalists in Ukraine who disagree with certain things that the government did, or certain things that Ukrainian militaries have done. For example, the video that was leaked with the Ukrainian soldiers, shooting at Russian captives. So we don't see the same level of restriction, obviously, that the Russian authorities are doing in Russia. But there's certainly certain limitations that the government has by nature of the war, by default. This is wartime reporting that the government has used to push for its narrative during the conflict.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to take a question here from Rowan Phillip, and I'm going to direct this first to Sami, because Sami has told us that he does need to leave right on time. We'll go a little longer for those who can stay. But Sami, Rowan asks about internet controls and free censorship circumvention tools like Sifon, which is an organization we work with, and VPNs. Are they able to help provide audiences access to independent news? What's the situation with those in Afghanistan?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Taliban have just started censoring internet by banning TikTok and some other online video games in the country. Some people believe that they do not have the kind of technological, tools to ban the internet yet, but they will get it soon, especially if you look in the kind of countries and governments who are supporting the Taliban in the region. So they will get it soon, either from China, Pakistan, Russia, or even Iran. Mm-hmm. So internet censorship is not yet a major problem in Afghanistan, but Taliban have banned all foreign media from the country. A number of media outlets, including BBC, Voice of America, and Deutsche Welle and others, used to run their news bulletins on local news channels. They had this kind of contract for years, for more than 10, 15 years now. But Taliban, banned all those content, and no other channel is allowed to broadcast foreign content, including foreign soap operas and serials. No foreign content is allowed in the country. So people are using satellites and internet to access international media, and also to access digital platforms on internet. But as I said, I'm afraid that Taliban will soon have that kind of tools to start censoring internet as well.
Anyone else seeing, very briefly, so we can get to more questions, anyone else seeing some benefit from use of these censorship circumvention tools in the places where they're working?
I've certainly seen it useful in Russia, actually. RSF has provided this VPN service, basically that provides mirror sites which, duplicate the content of a censored website or a blocked website inside Russia, and will, basically giving the content in a different server, and that's a very effective way to circumvent censorship coming from Moscow. So I see it very, very effective, in especially for the media outlets that have been covering the war in Ukraine.
Great.
Similar to most parts of Africa as well. Also, in places where there's no internet now, because it's internet is available to all of us who are talking, but in most parts of Africa, internet penetration is very, very low. And so the importance of now shortwave radio is very prominent now. We're seeing it being used in parts of the world where there's crisis, but in Africa, shortwave radio is king, because in remote places where people don't have smartphones, you have feature phones, and the importance of radio and shortwave radio, I'd like to emphasize, because that's how you reach places really remote from urban places that we are talking about.
So sometimes old technology is more important than new technology to get to people. That's great. I have a question here from Hiba Anjum, who asks about, in cases of civil wars, which obviously we're seeing in Ethiopia as one example of that. Do the tactics of war journalism, such as we're seeing in Ukraine when a foreign power is invading, apply, or are there differences in how you cover a civil war in terms of, I think there's some ethical questions here, maintaining space, keeping, how do you maintain your distance when you are personally involved, and Sirwan, you talked about that for Ukrainian journalists. But maybe Salem, you can talk about Ethiopia, where there is a civil war raging, and then either of the other panelists, if you want to talk about that as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And even the one that Sirwan tackled earlier about, has there been some effort from the Ukraine's government in a way of curtailing or making difficult for journalists in times of war? In times of war, governments always use national security as a as a big fig leaf for other things, either curtailing movement, like what I just mentioned about reporters in Ethiopia, for instance, not being able to go to places where there's conflict, whether it be it in Tigray or in the Oromia region, other regions where there's essentially just so many human rights abuses and atrocities happening in the dark. How do you, especially the environment in Ethiopia is very difficult, extremely complex. There is an ethnic aspect of with the conflict that's going on right now, people's identities being questioned simply because of their reporting. One case I just recently reported about is an Ethiopian journalist who happens to be from the Tigrayan ethnic group, who was reporting about rape and violence, gender-based violence in Tigray, which Human Rights Watch and other organizations have basically labeled as war crimes happening. But she was targeted and followed by and harassed by men who didn't really identify themselves, and basically essentially for her reporting about the conflict. So the ethical question that you raise about how do you cover conflicts when sometimes people are involved? It's very a delicate balance, especially looking at it from abroad right now. You have to make sure, and a concerted effort to make sure that you include as many voices as possible to get closer to the truth, which is what we do anyway when we cover stories. But it really is a delicate balance of not amplifying, for instance, one side when there's conflict involved. But it really is a case-by-case situation where when you have verified information of atrocities happening, you have to make sure that you take extra effort to make sure that you reach out to all sides. But one example I would like to mention, I remember when the conflict in Ethiopia started, there was a complete blackout and a lot of uncertainty of who is involved, because Eritrea was involved in the war with troops coming in, which the government later recognized. But for a significant amount of time, there was this blackout and a lot of confusion. And so we were able to reach out to people from all parts of the country through different means to get close to the truth. But it is very delicate, as we've seen as example in Ethiopia, very delicate for journalists, especially who are from these places, because their identity could be used against them simply for reporting. Their credibility could be questioned simply because of their identity. Yeah. It's very, very difficult and a balancing act, I would say.
Okay. Sirwan, do you want to address that as well in terms of Ukrainian journalists needing to, how do you maintain a distance and be sort of, if we can use the word, impartial when your country is being invaded by another country?
Definitely, yeah. All the points that Salem raised actually were excellent, and they can be seen elsewhere, in all conflict zones around the world. But to talk about Ukraine, I'd have to talk about Syria and draw on my own experiences while covering the war there. Coming from Syria, I had to deal with that. I struggle with that, being as objective as neutral, especially working with an international news organization as Voice of America that broadcasts to the whole world. It was a challenge, especially in the early days of the conflict in 2011, 2012, how to see, someone like me coming from a particular ethnic background. I've always had certain, ideas about the Syrian government, for example, but the longer the world, the longer the war it took, then, and it was the more difficult it became for people like myself, who understood the nuances of the reporting on this conflict. It was a multi-layered conflict. You have the Syrian opposition versus the Syrian regime. You have you have the Kurds versus the Islamic State. You have the Kurds versus the opposition regime versus ISIS. It was a very complicated war, and you have to keep a distance from all these groups, especially if you're reporting to a foreign audience that doesn't necessarily understand the the local dynamics and the local sense, the ethnic and religious aspects of the conflict. It was difficult. But one journalist in Syria that I interviewed in 2014, I think he captured it nicely. I asked him, he was the editor of a local radio station in the Kurdish region, and I asked him about his coverage of the Islamic State and what the Islamic State was doing, and it was like, look, we can try to be as objective as we could, but we can never be neutral in this conflict. You have to take sides. You can't just say, well, because they're part of the conflict. Which brings me to Ukraine. Really, what Ukrainian journalists have been doing is like reporting on their own stories, and often they become part of the story without even realizing. And that's why people like myself and Salem and Aliza and yourself have been doing is like highlight the stories of these journalists. These are humans, people that are impacted by everything that happened in their environment, and so I think it's a challenging question. You can never answer. There's no right answer to that question. Is like How do you, the most important part, in my opinion, is, instead of talking about objectivity and neutrality, is to talk about how to present the facts the way they are. And that kind of manifests itself in your own reporting, and the rest leave it for the audience, for your readers and viewers to decide. But it is very challenging.
I'm going to ask one more question to you, Aliza, and it kind of follows a little bit on what you were talking about regarding citizen journalism, and that is the idea of sort of media literacy and getting the public to understand why press freedom is so important, not just in some ethereal way, but to their lives. How do we get Mexicans outraged about the number of journalists who are being killed for reporting independently? How do we get people in countries? I mean, there are a lot of people outraged in Nicaragua, I know, but to get people to understand why this is important to them. Are you seeing any efforts there that are making a difference?
I think actually what both Salem and Sirwan have said kind of feeds into this, which is, a lot of times when you have, conversely, when there is a country that has a conflict, whether it's internal or external, I think that makes a lot of people pay attention to the news in a way that they might not have before, and perhaps the people who provide that news as well. So unfortunately, in situations of conflict and danger is a time when a lot of people suddenly start caring about where they get their news from for the first time. And I mean, even in the US, if you look at it in certain ways, a lot of newspapers will see huge surges like the week before an election or something like that, as suddenly everyone realizes that they actually, do want to know what's going on, or they do want to be informed. So I think for me, media literacy is one of those things that, if we want to see a change, we really want to start getting people while they're younger. And I think where we've seen like the most gains are when we're not just talking about media literacy with journalists, but when we're talking about media literacy with, as you mentioned, with news consumers, with people. And when we start getting people at a younger age, like children in schools and in libraries, invested in their own media literacy, that's when we start to see the biggest gains. But one of the biggest areas of concern that we've seen with disinformation, which, as a media development organization, we work a lot. Many of our colleagues work on disinformation programs. And I think one of the things that's kind of been maybe the most troubling is that it is really difficult for people to admit that they're wrong and to change their minds. And so a lot of times the most important thing is being the first one, not necessarily being the right one. And a lot of dictators have really picked up on that. They don't necessarily care if they're right anymore. They just have to be the first thing you hear. And then a surprisingly large amount of people will believe that and then just never change their minds, no matter how much you fact check. So it really just underscores why media literacy is important, why getting people to understand, what disinformation is and what to look for and what to not believe. I think that is something that, it is being talked about more, and I'm excited to see where the field goes. People have a lot of great ideas, and, it's going to take a long time before we see some of the effects.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. That's a great moment to end our discussion with a look ahead at what can happen in the future, and if we all join together and really get behind these efforts, maybe in the long run, we're going to be able to make some difference. So I want to thank everyone for joining us for this fantastic discussion. Thanks to all of you who posted questions. I wish we could have gotten to all of them. And to those of you who introduced yourselves in the chat, it was amazing to see the variety of places that our audience is coming from. I want to thank our 4 panelists. Sami has, as I mentioned earlier, had to leave us, but Sirwan, Salem, Aliza, thank you so much for your participation and your insights. I saw a lot of comments from people in the chat saying that they were really learning things from what you've talked about today. I want to thank our partner for this event, Voice of America, for providing us 2 wonderful panelists and also just your partnership in so many ways. Reminder that if you're on Facebook and you'd like to join the forum, please search for the ICFJ Pamela Howard Forum on Global Crisis Reporting and request to join the group. We would love to have you. Remember that we're also in Spanish, French, and Portuguese, and very soon Arabic. If you'd like to access our journalism resources, we encourage you to visit IJNet at www.ijnet.org in 8 languages. You can also sign up there to receive a weekly bulletin that will be packed with information that will help you be a better journalist. To learn more about the forum or our programs, please visit ICFJ's website, icfj.org. And ahead of World Press Freedom Day, we encourage you to check out VOA's Press Freedom page. That is Press Freedom, Voice of America, VOA News. Importantly, we'd love to hear about your experience with the forum. If you've been joining us for a while now, please fill out a brief survey linked in the chat on Zoom. And we would love to get your feedback because we use that to look at how we can provide better webinars and training sessions in the future. We do webinars like these where we have discussions with panelists, but we also do training sessions where we'll bring in experts who can talk to you about mobile journalism, strategies, or podcasting. So we want your feedback on what you would like us to be providing here on the forum and your thoughts on how this has gone. So thank you again for joining us. We'll see you again next week when we'll have another great webinar for you, and happy World Press Freedom Day, everyone. Thanks.